Hello and welcome to World Insight with Tian Wei, coming to you live from Beijing on CGTN. Coming up on today's program, the DPRK warns it will double its nuclear program efforts after the UN Security Council unanimously approves a new set of tougher sanctions. China-ASEAN Expo gets down to business in the city of Nanning, which bodes well for trade growth along the 21st century Maritime Silk Road. And we start with the long-lasting Korean Peninsula tensions. The UN Security Council put new sanctions on the DPRK recently. All countries seated at the table, including China, agreed to cut the DPRK's lifeline of textile exports and cap critical imports of oil products. China says these are necessary measures in response to Pyongyang's recent nuclear test. However, the DPRK slams the sanctions and vows to accelerate its plans to develop a nuclear program. Is the situation ever deteriorating?
A unanimous vote to rein in the DPRK after its most powerful nuclear test by far. According to U.S. estimates, the new sanctions would amount to a 10% cut in oil products shipped into the DPRK, and a ban on all of its textile exports will likely strip Pyongyang of more than $700 million in annual revenue. The DPRK rejected and condemned the resolution.
The adoption of sanction resolution against my country is an extreme manifestation of U.S. intention to eliminate, at any cost, the ideology, social system of DPRK and its people.
This UN resolution comes just a month after previous bans on DPRK exports of coal, lead, and seafood. That round of sanctions did little to persuade the DPRK from carrying out its sixth nuclear test on September 3 and announced it was a hydrogen bomb. The DPRK also vowed to inflict on the U.S. the greatest pain and suffering it had ever gone through.
The North Korean regime has...
But the U.S., which drafted the resolution, says Pyongyang can still find a way out. China has been calling for a suspension of the DPRK's nuclear and missile testing on one hand, and a halt to joint U.S.-South Korea military exercises on the other. However, neither Pyongyang nor Washington seems to be buying this double suspension. Now, China endorses this wave of sanctions, reiterating its position that talks should happen sooner than later.
China unswervingly stands for denuclearizing the Korean Peninsula, maintaining peace and stability there, and resolving the problems through dialogue and consultation.
So far, repeated sanctions have failed to deter the DPRK from continuing with its weapon development program. On the contrary, it has been testing more powerful bombs with a higher frequency in recent years. There is a big question mark over whether the latest sanctions will make any difference.
Could the new UN sanctions on the DPRK work? For some answers about that, we have in our Beijing studio Zhao Tong, fellow in the Carnegie's Nuclear Policy Program, based at Carnegie's Tsinghua Center for Global Policy here in Beijing. Welcome to our program. In Washington, D.C., the United States, we invited Douglas Paul, the Vice President of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Mr. Paul, welcome. And joining us in London from the UK, Ian Begg, who's a professorial research fellow at the European Institute of the London School of Economics and associate fellow at the Chatham House. Welcome as well, Mr. Begg. I want to start with the Chinese and the American panelist, Mr. Zhao. 15-0, that's the number of votes UN Security Council for this round of sanction. Quite a victory, some would say, in agreed actions. What does it say?
Well, it says that international community is consensus about the need to punish North Korea for its most recent provocations by testing what was likely a hydrogen bomb. However, there was still major disagreements about how far the sanctions should go in terms of punishing North Korea. But we have a good resolution which imposes unprecedented pressure on North Korea.
I see. Mr. Paul, before we talk about the rhetorics already flying around after the sanctions, let's just focus on the sanction itself. Could they be considered as a success?
Well, actually, I wouldn't say a success. I'd say it's another incremental step up in efforts to persuade North Korea and China to be more helpful in bringing this set of programs in missiles and nuclear testing to an end. I'm skeptical it's going to work, but I think it's very important that you have diplomatic cooperation. Eventually, we probably will be left with containment and deterrence. And for those two things to work with North Korea, you need international cooperation. So going through the diplomatic process of the UN Security Council helps to hold that cooperation together for the long term.
Well, when we talk about the cooperation, certainly it's not just China and the United States, but many other more members of Security Council, including the permanent ones. And Mr. Begg, you're coming from the UK. You definitely understand what I'm talking about. There seems to be a unity.
Important, as your previous speaker just said, because if the international community is divided, it's very easy for the rogue state, that's what we can call it, North Korea, to go its own way.
Well, the voice volume from Mr. Begg is relatively low, so we're going to adjust that a little bit. But for now, let me come back to you, Mr. Zhao. Earlier, we talked about that. Well, there seems to be some unity in at least this round of sanctions, but word's already coming out. For example, President Trump, in meeting with an Asian visiting leader, he was talking about these are just small steps. Whether it's going to work or not, it's not clear. Obviously, it seemed to be apparent brush off of what many consider as an effort by the international community for a long time to come. What do you make of those remarks?
Well, the United States has long wanted to impose the so-called crippling economic sanctions on North Korea, which is basically a comprehensive economic embargo that would completely cut off all North Korea's economic lifeline, making the regime incapable of sustaining itself. So the original text of the resolution proposed by the UN ambassador from the United States included all the most radical measures, such as completely cutting off the crude oil supply, completely seizing the assets of even the top leader Kim Jong-un, etc. But of course, countries like Russia and China have different concerns. They worry about the unpredictable consequences of a regime instability in North Korea. But finally, I think they were able to reach some agreement with somewhat watered-down resolution, which can still impose important pressure on North Korea without, short of making the regime unstable.
When we talk about the debate between China, Russia, and the United States, for example, as to what are the specific wording of this sanction, Mr. Begg, I understand you could speak now. What have been the roles of the others, let's just say, of the Security Council, some of the European members of it included at this point, in terms of this sanction, this round, and probably in the future when it comes to so-called ally cooperation, President Trump from the U.S. also talked about?
Well, we have to remember that two permanent members of the Security Council are European, France and the UK, so they inevitably have a significant influence on the other members of the Security Council. Plus, they speak in practice on behalf of the entire European Union, which is a significant economic power, even though its political power is sometimes less than its economic weight. I think what we're seeing now with this is more of a consensus at international level on trying to deal with North Korea. But I would come back to a very, very obvious point to make, is that when you impose sanctions that hit people, and the people do not have a direct way of influencing the leadership, it's highly unlikely to be effective in the way that you would want it to be.
Several things going on. Textile exports from North Korea being cut off, petrol products into North Korea being cut off, labor exports from North Korea to other countries being cut off, and prevention of any joint venture in North Korea or with North Korea being now out of the question. So, Mr. Paul, will these measures work to what extent?
I think that the choice we're trying to impose on North Korea through deprivation of resources and cash is is not going to be enough to compensate for the preference that North Korea has. And that preference is guided by the example of Muammar Gaddafi yielding his nuclear capabilities to the U.S. in the early 2000s, only to end up in a ditch dead in 2011. And Saddam Hussein having threatened and then dismantled his capabilities and then ending up hanged in a prison in Baghdad. And the motivation of Kim Jong-un is to avoid the fates of those men, no matter what the deprivation imposed upon him or his society.
But you know, Mr. Paul, when you are making that comparison, it really alerted a lot of ears because Gaddafi's, for example, it was about regime change. And a series of regime change in the Middle East have their impact in that region and the rest of the world too, after Iraq. So China, Russia also have been totally against any idea related to regime change in the DPRK from the United States or anywhere else. Mr. Paul, do you think all parties realize that there should be some common ground and prohibitions that they shouldn't touch on, Mr. Paul, U.S. included?
Well, preservation of the North Korean regime in order to maintain regional stability doesn't seem to be an option either, because the North is determined to change the security relationships in the region, to try to dismantle the U.S. Alliances with Japan and South Korea, to try to reunify the peninsula under North Korean rule. And that's at the macro level. At the micro level, our experience is entirely distasteful. They took a student from the U.S. who did a schoolboy prank and put him in jail and essentially killed him in the past year. So where do we deal with this kind of regime in a way that maintains stability? I think this is it's a stability where you have to overlook a lot of instability to try to find it.
Mr. Begg, during the talk after the UN sanctions being passed, President Trump specifically used the word the United States and allies for the future. He seemed to suggest the U.S. and its allies are likely to take certain actions when crises happen. Of course, the European allies is only part of the ally group. There are many others inside Northeast Asia. But from the Europeans' perspective, particularly after both the German and the French leaders are being consulted through phone calls by the Chinese leader, President Xi Jinping, what do you think about the attitude of the Europeans, UK included still at this point, about the issue?
On the one hand, I think it's fair to say that the Europeans are behind the thrust of the American approach, which is to try to defuse the problem as far as possible, and if necessary to threaten and to use the sanctions. But there's another dimension to this, which is that the only hard power in the area is called the United States. The Europeans have no military assets that they can use for this purpose, and they can't really do much about enforcing the sanctions either. So Europe is political support rather than the hard support that many might think America would want. And there isn't an answer through NATO, because NATO would only be invoked if there were an attack on a member of the NATO alliance. And that doesn't seem to be something that's likely to happen in the immediate future.
What about that? Will there be some kinds of parallel thing going on? China proposed parallel solutions, but there seems to be some parallel thing going on at the same time, Mr. Zhao. On the one hand, sanctions going on with the United Nations, 15-0. On the other hand, the special representative coming from the State Department from the U.S., Joseph Young, in Russia, talking to the North Koreans. We do not know exactly the content of the discussion, but that has been revealed in public media for some time now. How should we understand this?
Well, we can only see what we can see from the outside.
That's right.
But in fact, according to some recent reports, such as the story published by the Washington Post, that the U.S. Secretary of State Tillerson has been conducting secret dialogues with his Russian and Chinese counterparts about North Korea in a very close manner.
In fact, Tillerson just met the State Councilor Yang Jiechi on Tuesday. Of course, many would suspect their discussion include the DPRK issue as well.
Yes, and given the importance of North Korea crisis to the United States, Tillerson was able to set aside the major disagreements with Russia on many other issues and closely consulted Russia on how to deal with North Korea, how to draft a new resolution. And with China as well, there was a report that there was even close coordination between Washington and Beijing about possible contingency scenarios over the Korean Peninsula, how to deal with the issue of loose nukes in case there was, what happened in case something happened to the North Korean government. So there might be some very effective dialogues among these regional powers. That gives us some hope that maybe some diplomacy would work out sooner than we have expected.
Mr. Paul, you've been a big fish swimming in this pool for decades. I mean, Mr. Paul, you know all rounds of 6-party talks and the 2 parties, 3 parties, all these consultations. Do something going on these days really matter? I want to ask for your gut feelings.
Well, I have a small celebrity among North Korea watchers for having said for many years that North Korea will never talk under pressure. But without pressure, North Korea will never talk. And I think that's what we're facing here. The outline of recent developments, Mr. Tillerson has, in addition to what has been just mentioned, publicly stated 4 points about how the U.S. would not try to take advantage of reunification to advance American strategic interests, that we are not trying to dismantle the northern regime, that we are willing to talk. These things have been expressed to the Chinese side and to others, but in the meantime, to get us to the talks, to the table, pressure is necessary. They're 2 sides of the same coin. It's no point in talking about nice agreements if the pressure isn't there, and there's no point in trying to proceed without putting the pressure on and getting cooperation from the international community. So I think it's a complicated game, but it has, my experience, to answer your question, is this is the way you do it.
This is the way you do it. You have the sticks and you also have the carrots. Whether the carrots is big enough, that's of course for parties involved to judge. But here is the thing, Mr. Zhao. China did not get any carrot at all. Here's a lot of pressure on China. If you look at the U.S. media, the Republican Party is talking about not enough pressure on China. How come the Trump administration? You need to have more. And the Democrats are saying, well, probably you just exacerbate the situation. You know what? Eventually the pressure is still going to dump on China's head. On the other hand, Mr. Zhao, you know better than I do, and probably anyone here, China is going to have pressure about refugees if DPRK is suffering further from poverty. Secondly, China is going to suffer no matter what kinds of rhetoric and action-reaction thing going on between the DPRK and United States because China is on the border. And thirdly, any kind of accidents along China's border is going to have a big impact on China as well. So China is going to suffer anyway, not to mention the THAAD system that is already implemented in South Korea. China has been against it together with Russia for a long time. So what is the thing for China here? Is there a way that China can also protect its own interest while taking care of others as well? Mr. Zhao.
Exactly. I think in Washington there is polarized view about how to deal with North Korea. Some people want to take a softer approach, others demand so-called supercharged pressure on North Korea. And in Seoul as well, another important regional player, there was a very divided view in Seoul about the fundamental approach towards North Korea. So China is facing regional partners that themselves are facing important internal divisions. So there is important homework for other countries to do to come up with a coherent voice.
Mr. Paul, do your homework. Mr. Zhao is suggesting from Beijing.
It's very important for all regional countries to come up with a single voice, to come up with a coordinated strategy to deal with North Korea. That's the foundation for success.
Is Washington really doing its homework, Mr. Paul?
I hear all the time from various think tanks in Washington and other activists that the key is to put pressure on China. To me, that's just fundamentally wrong. The pressure needs to be put on North Korea, and we need to be talking to China about how do we deal with the consequences of that pressure. And the potential for instability with, that you mentioned, and refugees and other related issues are precisely what we should be talking about in contingency talks for dealing with the aftermath.
But here is the thing, Mr. Paul, there's a concern also. I mean, if the United States only want to talk to China about the contingency plan, that implies that China could agree to the United States about some of the actions that China do not agree at all. For example, regime change. For example, military actions. So the United States has to talk to China about how the diplomatic dialogue and conversation with DPRK should be heading on. Mr. Paul.
Well, contingencies can be very positive or they can be very negative, and realistic governments have to deal with both types of potential outcomes. So I think it's entirely possible to frame a constructive diplomatic dialogue around subjects that also touch on negative repercussions should this dialogue not be successful.
Mr. Zhao?
Yeah, I do think we also need to talk about under what conditions we should seriously engage North Korea. I think there is major disagreement about why North Korea hasn't come to the negotiating table despite the increasing economic pressure. There are fundamentally different views on the reasons, but we need to talk to have a common view on this.
Very crucial. Mr. Begg, you know, we're almost reaching the end of our discussion. People would wonder why we have someone from Europe to talk about this, because this is not a threat just to this region. It's a global issue that everybody is working on these days. So, Mr. Begg, as an important player in the world, how does Europe see this chunk of issue in terms of the overall challenges the world is facing right now? To what role that, for example, France, Germany, the UK will be able to play in further consultation with the Chinese side about the issue? Mr. Begg.
Well, I would hope that they'd be able to play the role of mediator, to have dialogue with the Chinese side and the American side in trying to influence things in a sensible direction. And I think you put your finger on it earlier when you mentioned carrots as well as sticks. You're talking about carrots in the context of what can be offered to China. But we also need to think imaginatively if there are any carrots that can be put on the table to induce the DPRK to do something different.
That's right.
And here maybe I can suggest an old-fashioned European ploy, which is to have negotiations about several things going on simultaneously and offer the carrots in a different domain from the one that's immediately on the table. Sometimes that's how Europeans solve problems, by an indirect carrot rather than one that concerns the immediate issue.
Interesting. Mr. Zhao, we only have 30 seconds left for you.
I mean, in terms of carrots, given that the United States and North Korea have put so much into their competition, they have put their reputation on the line. So it's difficult for the United States, for example, to back down. So in this case, it might be useful for some European countries to offer some economic sanction relief or lifting. That can be a workaround and make the major parties save face but still get agreement.
It's a bigger picture we're talking about today. And Mr. Paul, 30 seconds for you.
The South Koreans have been eager to find carrots to put on the table for North Korea. We now have a progressive government in South Korea which has a very big focus on North Korea, but they're not able to summon the energy and focus on carrots because they're dealing with the sticks coming from North Korea, the threats, the increasing pressure. So we need a lot of, the carrots are there if we need them.
I see. Douglas Paul, Ian Begg, Zhao Tong, gentlemen, thank you so much for being with us and sharing your insights. And you are watching World Insight with Tian Wei, still to come on our program. The China-ASEAN Expo opens its doors in the Guangxi city of Nanning with big expectations of growing trade along the modern Maritime Silk Road. Yes, you're watching World Insight with Tian Wei, coming to you Monday to Friday live on CGTN. The 14th China-ASEAN Expo opened Tuesday, highlighting trade and investment among China, ASEAN, and other countries along the Belt&Road routes. China and ASEAN's relations are getting ever closer as they seek to deepen economic cooperation and forge strong diplomatic ties, but all agree that there is still much work to be done before a solid regional integration could be ever achieved.
Finding new ways to further strengthen economic ties and integrate trade and investment in Southeast Asia. That topped the agenda of the ASEAN Economic Ministers meeting in the Philippine capital, Manila. It is expected that by 2050, ASEAN's economy will grow to over $9.2 trillion, making it the fourth largest economic bloc in the world. Despite rising protectionism and uncertainties in several trade policies, both China and ASEAN stress the need to reaffirm the importance of regional and global economic integration. Data showed China maintained its position as ASEAN's largest trading partner since 2009 and continued to its fourth largest source of foreign direct investment. Bilateral commodity trade reached over $300 billion in 2016, accounting for 16.5% of ASEAN's total trade value. And foreign direct investment from China hit over $9 billion in 2016, making up 9.5% of ASEAN's total. ASEAN ministers also welcomed China's proposal to synergize the Belt&Road initiative with the bloc's development strategy to further enhance bilateral ties.
China's Belt and Road initiative aims to create trade, financial, and cultural networks stretching from East Asia to Europe and beyond, focusing on key areas of industrial development, financial integration and reform, and infrastructure construction.
ASEAN countries hope the initiative could help create better trade and capital flows, as well as boost infrastructure connectivity for its 625 million people.
So what's the word on the China-ASEAN Expo leading up to the Maritime Silk Road? Let's turn to our panelists. Once again, we are joined by Zhao Tong, associate in the Carnegie's nuclear program with the Carnegie Tsinghua Center for Global Policy, and also joining us in Beijing studio, Rick Dunham, co-director of the Global Business Journalism program at Tsinghua University, a very well-established American journalist, been working in Washington for decades. Let me ask both of you about this question. You know, China-ASEAN, this story has been there for quite some time, but with the Belt and Road initiative, particularly the Maritime Silk Road, does it bring much possibility to this relationship, Mr. Zhao?
I do think so, because the 21st century is a globalized century. It's also a maritime century, so it's very important to increase connectivity, increase mutual understanding between countries, and the Silk Road initiative will be very important for achieving this goal.
Many, of course, China included, ASEAN countries too, have beautiful coastlines, and the cooperation about the sea, related to the sea, is certainly one of the key components of the economy.
It's true, and it goes two ways. One is delivery of commerce by ship. Another is tourism. The potential of Chinese tourists on the beaches around Southeast Asia. So again, that one goes both ways. But the seas are. I mean, it was the original Maritime Silk Road for a reason.
That's right. And
ports.
Earlier there was the BRICS summit, and one of the things people talk about is how to get to know one another better, not through a third source. I'm not saying the American press. I'm just saying not through a third source, but rather through direct communications. China-ASEAN, the same way. Mr. Zhao, there are different kinds of development stages and also history backgrounds to these ASEAN countries. Some come out of the colonial days, others have been struggling on their own for decades. How do you think this group, the unity itself, and the possibility of working with China on a newer level?
Right, as you pointed out, there was long historical roots of the trading relationship between ASEAN countries, well, ASEAN region and China, dating back all the way to the Han Dynasty in China. And that process was interrupted in recent centuries by the colonization process and independence of new national states, etc. But that process, I think, was renewed recently. And as you also mentioned, I think China and ASEAN countries are now at slightly different stages of country building and industrialization. China is at an advanced stage of industrialization and therefore has very good technologies and experience that can be shared with ASEAN countries. And also China's advanced electronic products, its agricultural technology, its technology for renewable energy are very needed in ASEAN countries. And in return, the fruits, the food products, the daily consuming stuffs are very much favored by Chinese consumers. So the economic relationship between ASEAN and China are really mutually complementary. So I think that's very important.
But at the same time, the TPP, of course, has been a story of the past, even though there have been efforts to revive it from time to time. Yet the Maritime Silk Road, the Belt&Road initiative, has been advocated quite widely in the region. Do you think there could be spaces for the ASEAN countries to come in, not just as a receiver of fund coming from China, but rather also to have their own input as to how to make the idea work on a bigger basis to everybody's advantage? Mr. Zhao, very briefly before I move to Mr. Denham.
Well, I think ASEAN countries possess a very important geological position. Right? It's the first leg of China's Maritime Silk Road, and China's own trade depends very much on the maritime lanes of shipping in the South China Sea.
That's right.
So I think that's why ASEAN has become such an important region for China's Maritime Silk Road initiative. And ASEAN actually becomes a regional hub for the initiative. So I do think there is a lot of potential. And also ASEAN helps connect China with other countries along the road, along the Silk Road. Silk Road.
Yes.
And at this ASEAN-China Expo, there were expeditions areas for other countries like Kazakhstan, Pakistan. So ASEAN actually becomes the bridge between China and other countries.
Very interesting going on there. Mr. Denham.
Well, I see, in addition to the issue of China and ASEAN, you have a growth in regional trading blocs. You have globalization on the retreat overall. And then you also have Donald Trump in the United States and the America First trade policy. So there are opportunities for regional trade blocs in Asia and the Pacific to grow. And you had Donald Trump day one pulling out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, effectively destroying the years of negotiations. So the question is whether China emerges as the dominant force, or what is the role of China, Japan, and Korea in dealing with ASEAN.
That's very true. The ASEAN +1, +2, +3 has been the mechanism for quite some years. So the ASEAN countries also seem to, Mr. Zhao, try to keep a balance about its positions vis-a-vis these three countries as well. And of course, these countries have different kinds of relationship with their ally, the United States. What do you make of the capability of balance of ASEAN countries over the years so far, Mr. Zhao?
I think, of course, on security issues, ASEAN countries want to balance between big powers. That's the best way to defend their own interests. But I think economic issues are of a different nature. It's always mutually beneficial. U.S. closed down the TPP initiative, but instead China offered the regional comprehensive partnership. And that has received very good feedback from regional countries. The negotiations on that are expected to conclude by the end of this year. And the great rate of growth increase between ASEAN and China is a testimony of the mutually beneficial economic relationship. The rate of growth between ASEAN and China has been much greater than China's overall trade growth rate. And after the upgrade of the ASEAN-China free trade area in 2015, the ASEAN-China trade actually increased much faster.
That's right.
So I think that all demonstrates that we can build a mutually beneficial economic relationship.
So when it comes to trade, I mean, there seems to be a very natural link there between China and ASEAN. But you know, Mr. Denham, it's no secret that some countries in the region have been talking about, when it comes to security guarantee, let's just work with the United States. When it comes to trade and economic issues, of course we go to China. It has a lot of cash and ready to invest in the region. What do you make of these seem to have in a way, very shared responsibilities, will they really serve the interests of the ASEAN countries eventually?
I think eventually you can't just have one big nation be your security blanket and the other one be your economic lifeline. I think you have to integrate, or you have to choose. And I mean, I think the biggest challenge for China with the ASEAN countries is that there are some political disagreements, particularly territorial disagreements, and those are the things that China has to manage, because if you have good relationships, good diplomatic relationships, it will help open the door for the economic, and especially if the United States is in retreat from the global marketplace. There is such an opportunity right now, but China has to pivot a little bit to make sure that it is welcomed with open arms in those countries.
We see some different development stages of the relationship between China and some of those ASEAN countries when you say there could be some territorial disputes. At the very beginning, there seemed to be some tensions going on there. And then it seems parties calm down, seeming to understand that there's no other way but to be able to settle it through discussions and diplomatic ways. And they're then followed up with Belt and Road initiatives, the summit of it, for example, being held earlier in China. And now you see even the countries like the Philippines have been trying to make an extra effort together with China to try to handle the issue within a framework which both sides agree. And on a bigger scale, that is happening as well between China and ASEAN countries. You also see China's positions trying to compromise what the others have been having in their minds. So have we found relatively a matured path of handling the day-to-day issues and moving forward to really establishing some kinds of strategic trust, at least on territorial issues, in order to move forward? Mr. Zhao.
I think we're already moving there.
Yes.
There is indeed a serious security disagreement in the region, especially over the South China Sea, that has a deep historical root. However, I think, as Rick just mentioned, I think the economic mutual dependence really helps stabilize the political relationship. So when there are security disagreements, I think the countries will have a harder time to fight each other. They will have more interests in pursue a mutually acceptable agreement to settle the disputes. And also the Maritime Security Road initiative is not only about economic development. No. It also has important component, that is people-to-people exchange. And increasingly, my personal experience is my colleagues are increasingly going to ASEAN countries, Indonesia, Vietnam, Philippines, Singapore for vacations. They visit local communities, and also I have increasingly foreign colleagues coming from these countries. Right. So I think this people-to-people exchange will really help increase better mutual understanding, and that will, in the long run, help resolve the historical dispute. And you see this year's coming APEC summit is also likely to be held in the ASEAN country, one of those, Vietnam. So certainly the state leaders are also going to get there and try to work out some of the issues related to it. Mr. Dunham, what about the future? How are we on the right path?
I think we are on the right path. I echo the thoughts about people-to-people. My program at Tsinghua, the Global Business Journalism Program, has had students from Vietnam and Malaysia. Thailand. You look
younger generation from all of these countries.
And these are people who are looking toward the future. I mean, they are interested in both business and journalism, and so I think that there is an opening there, and for cooperation between the countries where China has economic assets that can help the other countries develop. I mean, where they benefit, where it's not just economic colonialism.
Very interesting. There are a lot of things going on when it comes to people-to-people exchanges. Some say it's got to be very slow to turn the nature of the relationship, but you know what? You have to do it. And then things will change for the better, we hope. Thank you so much, Rick Dunham and Zhao Tong. Thank you. Really appreciate it. And that is all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, try to find us World Insight CGTN in your search engine or check out our YouTube channel. You can also follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Sina Weibo. From me, Tian Wei, and everyone on the World Insight team, thanks for watching. Tune in again next time for insights across China and around the world. Good night.